Welcome, everyone, to this recorded training on how to use this housing preservation Proforma tool created by Grounded Solutions Network in partnership with Enterprise Community Partners. I'm Alex Cabral, a member of the Innovative Finance team at Grounded Solutions Network, and I will be leading you through this recorded training. This model that we're about to discuss is built to help municipalities shape their affordable housing funding strategies. You can likely find many other uses for this model as well, but it's primarily structured as if you were creating a housing fund and needed to understand project types, affordability levels, and subsidy and financing needs across a portfolio of housing projects. The tool has a specific focus on shared equity housing. That's limited equity housing cooperatives, multifamily shared equity homeownership projects, and single family shared equity homeownership projects. These are slightly different than traditional cooperative and homeownership proformas, so I'll point out the differences there. The tool is not recommended to be used as a detailed proforma. There's a lot of info that we've included on each sheet, so we had to be intentional about what to include. So if you require modeling details for a specific project, there's likely better models to use. So we're going to walk through this model step by step. If you have any questions, please reach out to the folks at Enterprise or myself. I'm at acabral@groundedsolutions.org. I will put my contact information on the screen. So let me go ahead, share my screen, and we will get started. If you see me looking to the left, it is because I am using two screens. Okay, get sure this is up. Let's do a quick overview of this model. We have a few tabs. We have the instruction tab here. Let me scroll to the top. The instruction tab here. We have a fund summary tab. We have four different tabs at the bottom. These are all different project proformas, which we will walk through. We have a tab called income limits, and this is a reference tab for the proformas. And we have a couple cost data tabs for different projects, and I will go into all of these in detail. We'll start with the instruction tab. Here at the top, we have an overview section. This includes what I've just explained. It also includes my contact info here. It will include a link to this recording and the password to review it, or if it's posted on YouTube. It also includes the password that you will need to unprotect the model. The cells that aren't meant to be changed will be protected throughout the model, so that way you don't accidentally remove a key formula. But you can unprotect the model and change it if you'd like. And again, this is a note to please reach out with any questions or if you find any errors. Then we have the background section here. This section includes what you should keep in mind when working within each proforma. Like for example, what kinds of assumptions are built into the model for the way that it is structured, right? This model is built to encompass many scenarios, but it does not include every scenario imaginable. So this gives you some background on what to expect. This section is the instructions on how to use the model. So this is what we're going to walk through together, where we're going to spend most of our time. In case you forget or need a refresh or would like to read it rather than visually watch it, you can come back here. and the instructions are based on the multifamily rental tab. Um, and as you scroll down, it calls out, it has separate sections and it calls out other tabs that are not the multifamily rental tab to point out the differences in those tabs. But across all four pro formas, they have a lot of commonalities. They will start to look familiar. The last section here is the glossary. And as I mentioned, this model features a few different shared equity housing project types. Here's a glossary to remind you what exactly those project types are if you're not familiar with them or just want to make sure you have the same understanding as what the model is portraying. Okay, so to get started, when using this model, your first step will actually be a few tabs down at this income limits tab. And um, for this purpose of this walkthrough, we're going to assume that you're going to use all tabs in the pro forma. So for all figures in blue, you're going to fill in for your region, for the region where these projects will be built, the the rent limit and the income limit, which should be available online related to your MSA, your metro service area, or your municipality. I will mention that we ask you to fill these out here, but you will not need to fill out rent limits or income limits in any of the other tabs. These should pull automatically into all other tabs. So every time you are, being asked for the rent limit for a one bedroom at 60% AMI, this number here will show up. If you know for certain that you're not going to use one of these AMIs, for example, you know for certain that not a single one of your projects is going to have a market rate unit, you can just leave it blank. Either put zero or um, just leave it completely blank. Okay. The next step is filling out the pro formas. But before we do that, you may want to either double check your numbers or maybe the project doesn't exist yet and you need a reference point. This is where we're going to go to the last two tabs, which talk about costs. So first, we'll take a look at this raw cost data tab. This tab here includes real, actual project cost data for 25 different projects across California, most of which are in the Bay Area or Los Angeles, as you can see here. These projects were completed between 2020 and 2025. As we know, costs increase over time, so keep that in mind that this is only as relevant as it is to that time period. Um, this tab here gives you a sense of the number of units in each project, the rent AMI, the year it was built, the building size, the purchase price. It also has a few rows for development costs. So all these in blue here are soft costs. All these in orange here, additional construction costs. Then you have your total development costs. As we keep moving to the right, it includes rehab levels, funding sources, amounts, and where they came from. Continue moving to the right. It includes utility costs for operating the property. And then here we have some summaries, some per unit costs, and some project notes if helpful. Now, if this feels like a lot of information to digest, you can hop over to the cost summary table tab. Let me zoom in here a bit. This tab here gives you a sense of the data we just saw, but broken into geography, building size, and rehab level. It gives you the median of these costs, the average, the minimum, and the maximum as you scroll to the right. It also down below breaks down the hard costs and the operating costs, and it provides you a nice color scale. The greener the cell, the lower that cost is as a percentage of the total costs, and the closer it gets to red, the higher percentage that cost is of total cost. So let's say you don't have project data for a project you are envisioning, so you decide that you are going to develop a 16 to 30 unit building in the urban SoCal area with light rehab, and you take a combination of these costs, and the average is 213,000. So you make that your purchase price, this per unit, by the way. So this is a great way to influence uh, or gut check some of the costs that you'll put into the pro formas if you don't have a great sense of what you should be spending or what a appropriate estimate should be. Okay, now that we've gotten through those few tabs, we're going to start filling out our pro forma. A reminder before we dive in, this model is interactive. It creates various outputs at once. So please gut check the outputs, make sure that they make sense. This model won't give you the answer. It makes it more efficient to arrive to the answer. So please make sure you are double checking everything to make sure that it's penciling out well and in a way that makes sense. Okay, so for this walkthrough, we're going to walk through the multifamily rental tab. To save time, I've already input a lot of the data we're going to use. I'll draw your attention here first to the key. This key exists on every tab. It doesn't change across the tabs. So you'll notice that anything labeled in blue is applicable to all phases. Each pro forma has two phases, an acquisition rehab phase and a perm phase. And we say perm for the multifamily rental, but for example, in a homeownership pro forma, this would be the sale phase or the disposition phase. So the acquisition rehab phase will be in green, as you can see here, for example, and the perm phase will be in pink, just so you're clear on what you're looking at. Anything yellow is mainly highlighted for attention. Um, Anything in blue, any fonts in blue means that you need to input the number. It's a manual input. Anything in black does not need to be changed and will be locked. Anything in black is likely a formula, and it does not need to be changed unless you don't like the formula that's in there. Okay, the first thing we're going I should also mention that many of the cells have notes on them, and these notes are meant to serve as explanations on calculations or assumptions that aren't obvious. So I'll point those out throughout our walkthrough, but I won't necessarily explain them. Some of them are a bit lengthy. Our first step to filling out this pro forma is this unit and affordability mix table. Now this here asks you the number of units of each bedroom type and the affordability level. So make sure when we're working with these types of tables, I'll explain the scenarios once we get through inputting the data, but make sure these start on scenario one, right? You have options one, two, three. Make sure they start on one. And you can see that this table is broken up by number of bedrooms. So here we have a studio, one bedroom, two bedroom, three bedroom, etc. And within those, you have different affordability levels, 50% AMI, 60, 80, 100. We don't cover the full range of AMIs, but you can always go in and edit the various cells if you, for example, wanted 70% AMI or something like that. So we're going to fill in, because we've selected scenario one, we're going to fill in column one here. And we're going to put, I'll zero these out so you all can see how this works. Okay, so say I have a 12 unit, I want to build a 12 unit multifamily rental building, acquire rehab. And I am going to make all of the units 80% AMI. So I'm going to put for one bedrooms at 80% AMI, for two bedrooms at 80% AMI, and for three bedrooms at 80% AMI. As you can see, as I'm putting in the numbers, not only is the yellow being highlighted, but the active scenario column is automatically updating with the number that I've put into scenario one. Now you can see I already have scenario two filled in. I still have 12 units, but maybe I want a different affordability, and we'll get back to this in a second. But just to show you how the scenarios work, once I change it to scenario two and hit enter, my active scenario column updates to reflect whatever is in scenario two. So this makes it easy to switch between number of bedrooms and affordability levels without having to do too much extra legwork. And if you don't have anything um, filled in this in scenario two or scenario three, it will automatically revert to what is in scenario one. Okay, so we'll go back to our scenario one. We've filled out what we think our unit mix will be. And we also want to fill out the appraised value of each unit as complete. So if we were to sell these on the market, and these automatically fill in below, and these calculations will help us calculate our loan to value for the perm loan, which is why they're there. You can also see that these, once I've filled in the one bedroom at 80% AMI, these are automatically populating with the rent levels that I filled in the income limits tab. So as I change, for example, if I change to scenario two, you can see that it will automatically populate. Um, Anytime I have a unit in the active scenario tab, the rent will automatically populate, and this rent will help me calculate the gross income for the property when we get to that point. So let's go back to scenario one, and now that we've filled that out, oh, I should also mention you can put notes for yourself here. So actually, this should probably say all 80% AMI units. This one is a mix of 60% and 80% AMI. So again, this is blue, and that means you are free to edit. Make notes to yourself. Okay, next we're going down to the acquisition rehab cost table. This is down here. This table represents the costs that the project will incur during the acquisition and rehab phase, and it is split between hard costs, which includes purchase price and other hard costs, and soft costs. And here we have the total at the bottom. Once again, you're going to fill in the blue cells. And as I mentioned, if you're not sure what to put in these cells, you can always reference the raw cost data or the cost summary table to give you a sense of what should go here. Also note that there are blue cells on the left here. These influence some hard calculations here. For example, for this model, we structured it so that the rehab cost per unit would be the same for every unit, acknowledging that if a unit's bigger, it likely will have a bigger cost Here, just for ease, we're asking for an average rehab cost per unit, and that'll automatically populate here with the number of units in the project. We also left space for whether or not the project requires a prevailing wage. As you can see, if you click yes, a 25% increase is calculated to the costs here. So if it's no, it'll remain zero. If it's marked yes, it'll increase the cost by 25%. And we also have a hard cost contingency. Similar items here at the bottom. Uh, Oftentimes, either your organization or a lender or funder will require a certain number of months for the replacement reserve and a certain number of months for the operating reserve, which are automatically calculated here, and they're multiplied by the figures in the operating assumptions table, which we'll get to shortly. This here gives you a couple different options for developer fee. You can change between a flat fee or a base fee. And these numbers here help you get, if you're using a flat fee, you just put in the percentage. If you're using a base fee, it's the base multiplied by however the cost per unit times the number of units. So that toggles there. And you can see this financing cost, it's an estimate. So if you click on the note, it provides a definition for the calculation. You're likely going to want this number here to match, get pretty close to your estimate of cost financing although this is an overestimate for reasons explained here in the note. And the reason why it's separate and it's not calculated within the model is because of circular references, which we are trying to avoid. So now let's say we've filled out all of our project costs. We get a project cost of 9.5, which comes to 795 per unit. Oof. Okay. Then we're going to go to acquisition and rehab funding sources table. Now this table represents the funding sources that will fund the costs in the acquisition and rehab phase. We have 6 different funding types. I'll walk through briefly and then we'll go through each one. We have an acquisition rehab senior loan. We have a subordinate loan that can convert from IO to P&I, which means it will be interest only during the acquisition rehab phase. And if it lasts longer than the senior loan, if the term of the loan is longer than the term of the senior loan, it will actually convert into P&I in the perm phase of this model. So this is a subordinate loan that can convert from interest only in the ag rehab phase to principal and interest repayment in the perm phase if the term is longer than the senior loan. If it's the same as the senior loan, it will pay off. It will pay off it will pay off with the permanent financing. We also have 3 different slots for residual receipts loans. These are subordinate loans. They appear in the acquisition rehab phase, but don't begin to pay off until the perm or stabilized phase. So they're 0% interest rate in the AC rehab phase, and the interest is accrued and capitalized into the loan. And then repayment is structured with residual receipts, which in many municipalities means that the repayment in the perm phase is the lesser of the annual interest charge or a certain percentage of project cash flows. So it often means that the principal balance remains and is most often forgiven, and any cash flow will be used to pay off the interest that has accrued. We also have a spot for rehab tax credits here. We also have sponsor equity, which is often the equity requirement that's, the the housing developer funds the pre-development, and that's the equity that's gone into the deal, or the lender requires a certain amount of equity, usually 5 to 12% that the developer has to put in before any loans are drawn on. That's the spot there. And then we have three different grant types, grant one, grant two, and grant three. You can rename them for ease, peace of mind. There's no difference between the three loans. They all do the same in the structure of this model. They all serve the same purpose. Okay. So I just going back to the senior loan, right? Once again, we're going to want to make sure this is on scenario one, and we're going to fill in column one. So at the moment, we're going to fill in the loan to cost. This will likely change, and I'll show you why in a second. But for now, we're going to just put 75%. We're going to fill in our interest rate, the loan terms, the loan fees. We're going to fill in the same information for all of these loans, right? This is what it's asking for here in black. You are going to fill in the necessary information here in blue. And that should take care of this here. If you're curious to where these numbers are going, we'll get to this in a second at the end. But here are all of our acquisition costs and the sources and uses summary. Oh, and here are all of the sources that we just put in. Okay, so you can see that we have a bit of a surplus here. We will resolve that in just a minute. Okay, so we're still filling out all of our data. We're gonna hop over here, keep scrolling to the right. This little table here is just a quick AMI summary. It tells you um, what percentage of units, just the AMI count per units, how many units are at 80% AMI, like we decided all 12 units are at 80% AMI, gives you the AMI average. And then these couple numbers here will help us calculate our welfare tax exemption, which you can see over here. But just a little summary table. We're going to go over to the operating assumptions tab. Now you see that we've just shifted into the pink. This means that we are now filling in project data for the operating stabilized phase of the project. Now, this section will only be applicable for the multifamily rental and the limited equity housing co-op tabs. It's not applicable for homeownership because instead of having an operating pro forma, those homes will be sold. So this section looks a bit different, and I will walk through that when the time comes. Here we're going to fill out our annual escalations, what we assume the rent to increase annually, the vacancy rate, what that will be annually, bad debt, the expense escalation, right? Expenses go up every year, and the number of months of operating reserve coverage we hope to maintain. We're also going to fill in year one expense estimates. And by year one, I mean year one of stabilization. This pro forma does not include a pro forma. This model does not include a pro forma for the period of time when the property is operating during the acquisition rehab phase, right? Sometimes there are tenant relocations, rent goes down, units are vacant, there's a lot of movement. That part of the process is not included in this pro forma. We have the acquisition, rehab costs, and we have an operating pro forma when the property is stabilized. We did not include an operating pro forma for when the property is undergoing rehab. So just keep that in mind. Okay, so we're filling out the operating assumptions table. Then we're going to come down to the permanent funding sources. So as you remember, we filled out the acquisition and rehab funding sources. Now we're doing permanent funding sources. We have four new funding sources here and one that's brought over from the acquisition rehab phase. So again, make sure to have scenario one selected for when we're first filling out this table. Then we're going to fill in our information for the permanent senior loan. We're going to again assume LTV, but assuming that this will likely change. This is probably the number that will change most frequently, the LTVs on the loan, because oftentimes um, properties with tenants supporting low to moderate income tenants aren't able to draw on the full loan to value because they won't meet debt service. So I'll explain that more in a second. Um, so you're going to fill out your loan terms, and then you'll see here that that the that we have both the loan amount, what the loan amount would be under the max LTV, so what it would be at 75%, and we have what the loan amount would be under the max debt service covenant ratio, debt service coverage ratio, covenant, which our lenders have set at 1.2. So you can see, as I mentioned, there's a pretty big difference here. Although, maybe our lenders would lend to us a 75% LTV, the 1.2 debt service coverage ratio actually inhibits our loan amount a bit. So it doesn't even reach 1.5. We'll jump over to the pro forma, the operating pro forma in a second. But it will always assume the loan amount at the debt service. It will always assume the minimum between these two, which is often the debt service coverage ratio covenant minimum. Here's the subordinate loan that carried over from, let me move over a little bit, that carried over from the AC Rehab funding sources. Um, as you could see, there is no loan amount here because the loan paid off, but let's just say we got the loan for 15 years. Then you can see this updated to 50,000 because it carried over. The model knows that the loan lasts longer than the acquisition rehab phase. So it actually tells you there's 12 more years on the loan term after the acquisition rehab phase. And to give us some more time, you can add some additional interest only periods, right? Maybe you negotiated with the lender and in order to get your property a bit more stable, in order for rents to go up a bit, they've given you 4 more years of interest only, let's just say. And you can amortize it over whatever period you'd like. Then there's also a debt service covenant ratio. I'm going to change this back to 3 years. Okay. Here's another subordinate loan. It starts at the perm phase. So this is the only subordinate loan that starts at the perm phase. Fairly standard terms here that you can fill in. It will amortize. Um, these two funding sources are a bit unique in that oftentimes you don't see additional opportunities for cash infusions in the perm phase. Well, we'd like to push back on tradition, and say that, based on mission and the goals of your community and your municipality, you may want the opportunity to provide additional cash infusions to the project at the perm phase. So here's additional sponsor equity. This is a one-time infusion of cash. It's not repaid, so it would, kind of be like a grant, and it happens in the year of your choosing. So here we have year 5, which I'll show you where it appears in a second. And grant type number four is ongoing subsidy. So if, let's say this is a high cost market and your expenses are high, but your building serves 50% AMI tenants, you may need annual cash subsidy to keep the building going. So, this is 100,000 that will start in year six and continue through the 15-year period. Okay, the final table in this sheet is the 15-year operating pro forma. This represents the property budget. We go all the way to the end for 15 years. Nothing needs to be filled out in this table, actually, except for when we get to the bottom. So you have your income here. These are all assumptions that you've already filled in. You have expenses here. Here's where your operating subsidy comes in. So if you remember, we put in 200,000 in year five. Boom. And then we started providing $100,000 subsidy infusion starting in year six and thereafter. So these are actually, you have your net operating income and these are added thereafter. And they can help you service the debt, essentially, service the debt, or yeah, cover any additional expenses. Here we have the operating reserve draw. There was a request from the group, and some lenders allow any cash shortfalls to be filled by drawing on the operating reserve. So we actually included a toggle here if it's allowed or if it's not allowed. As you can see, if it's not allowed, this will remain zero. And there is a cash flow shortfall. If it is allowed, then um, the model will draw from the operating reserve. As you can see, it fills the cash shortfall gap. There's no more cash shortfalls. You end up with zero cash at the end of the day, but it fills any gaps so it doesn't become negative. So other than this toggle here, what you need to fill in is at the bottom here. So this is the operating reserve and the replacement reserve. The operating reserve appears in a couple different places. We'll spend some time on this because it is important. The operating reserve first appears here in the acquisition and rehab costs. We're saying that we need 6 months of coverage for operating reserve. So what this calculation is doing describes here in this table, in this note, but it's essentially calculating the cost of operating the cost of operating the property using the assumptions we've included here, plus the cost of debt, and it's providing you with a six months capitalized operating reserve. Now, here the next place it appears is here in the operating assumptions, and again, we're still aiming for 6 months. And when we go down here, the first place that we have to fill in is the beginning of year operating reserve balance. Now, we didn't want to assume, right, from this 350,000 that you did or didn't spend any of it down, right? Your AC rehab could have taken 6 months or 2 years. You could have spent all of this. You could have spent none of it. So that's something here that you can plug in here to specifically name what you're starting the project off with. And then you're also going to name or estimate about how much you're going to spend down on this reserve each year. So we're saying $3,000. And this calculation here will always make sure that you have about 6 months of operating reserve. As you can see, it falls a bit below 6 months. That's actually because we're not starting with enough of an operating reserve. So if I bump this up here, I add about 30 more thousand, you can see that now we're in the clear. Now we will definitely have at least 6 months of coverage throughout our operating period. But for the sake of this exercise, we'll leave it so you can see that there is a gap here. And this is when I mention you need to gut check the numbers, right? It won't exactly give you the right answer. It'll tell you the reality of the situation in which you input. Replacement reserve, similar. You're starting off, we're saying with $10,000 because we're not sure how much you spent from what you put in the acquisition rehab budget, and you're spending out about 4,000. And this here um, is the running balance, and the replacement reserve, right, is part of the expenses. So you will always be contributing to the replacement reserve. So ideally it would always have a running balance. And the operating reserve is only contributed to if there is positive cash flow at the end of the year. Those are the two differences between those two reserves. Here at the bottom of the table, you have running loan balances. So this will tell you how quickly you're paying off the loans. And as you can see, this is zero because our subordinate loan number one ended with the ag rehab period. Okay, now for the fun part. Okay, we have filled out everything, every assumption that we think our project, what we think our project will look like. And we come to the very far left to the sources and uses summary. Based on our acquisition costs and our sources, we have a surplus. We have more cash than we know what to do with. When does that ever happen? But based on the permanent sources and uses, we actually have a cash shortfall, which is to say we're taking out these two loans, and based on the size of our perm loan and sub debt and income generated from the property, we don't have enough money to, we have an imbalance, we have a deficit. So this is telling me I probably can't take on as big of a senior loan during the AC rehab phase as I had estimated. So what I'm going to do is go back here, and I've already done some of the math ahead of time. I'm trying to figure out, I'll put in 20, I'm trying to figure out what makes sense in terms of loan size. So I want to leave my assumptions in scenario one, but we're going to make some changes here. So I'm going to go to scenario two, and I'm starting off with an loan to cost of 20% instead of 75%. Now I can see here, when I look in perm sources and uses, my deficit is much smaller, right? So I was at one $5.6 million deficit. I dropped my loan size down. My deficit is much smaller, 330,000. My surplus up above is also much smaller. I need to get this to a surplus. So I'm going to keep going down. Let's plug in 15%. That's a pretty good surplus. It could be break even, but this is development and we want to have a little bit of cushion, right? So let's say I model out 140,000. And again, I have a small surplus of 172,000. We can make these numbers smaller as well. We can go a little bit more specific, right? If I go up 1%, my surplus goes down to 45,000, right? So we're just playing around here to get our sources and uses to balance or to end up in a bit of a surplus. Now, as you can see, if I go with this mix of sources, we need $7 million for this 12-unit project, which comes out to about 583,000 per unit. Maybe I'm thinking, whoa, it's a lot of money that we don't have. So how can I use, slightly less subsidy? So I've already done the math here, like I said. Oh, I should back up and say we have low debt. I changed this, but I also added, here's the difference. Ooh. I also added some more subsidy. Okay, so when I drop down to 50% debt, now I have a surplus or a deficit here because I lost a lot of my acquisition and rehab loan funds. So then I'm going down here, right? How can I get some of that source back? Instead of a $1 million grant, I'm going to ask this funder for a $2 million grant. And that's how I got both of them to be a surplus. But now, right, that's a lot of subsidy, as I was saying. So now I want to use slightly less subsidy. Let me go here. Start over here. Okay. So we're going to model in slightly less subsidy and model 3. So what I'm going to do in model 3, right, is maybe, oh, I have 16% debt. I still need a bit more sources and my acquisition rehab. So maybe I go down and I bump up my subordinate loan, my residual loans, right? Um, those don't pay off until the perm phase. I can go down and add in more sponsor equity. Maybe, we have more cash to put into the project. So at a 300,000, I want to make sure that this is still, oh, missing a 0. Okay, I want to make sure that this carries over because remember, any changes that I make into scenario 2, if they're not in scenario 3, it will default to scenario 1. Okay, so I added in a little bit more subsidy. Let's see. Now I'm well over the, oh, because I wanted to use less subsidy, that's right. So yeah, let's say instead of 200,000, what was my surplus here? 400,000. Yeah, why don't we remove 400,000? Right, so we're saying, what does it look like? 400,000 less. Now we have a small surplus in both the acquisition rehab phase and the perm phase, and the subsidy per unit went down slightly. We didn't take on any more debt, but we could have, and that would have brought the subsidy down even more. So as you can see, there's different ways to play with the scenarios here. And don't forget, this is only one place where you can play with scenarios. Maybe you actually want to make the project a little bit more affordable, right? We have it, um, it's all 80% AMI, right? Scenario 2 has a mix of 60 and 80% AMI. So what does that look like in this case? Um, in this case, we're still good on the sources and uses, but because it got more affordable, we actually need, again, we have a deficit here in the perm phase because we can't afford to pay off such a large acquisition rehab loan. So then if I wanted to go with this affordability, I would go back again and choose one of these scenarios to lower my AC rehab senior loan and likely increase my subsidy or another debt source. So there's different ways to play with this. And you can play with the unit mix, you can play with the acquisition funding sources, and remember you can play with the perm funding sources to make sure that you get to a project that pencils. Okay, now that we understand how the Proforma works, I'm going to point out the differences in the other tabs. Remember, we're working in the multifamily rental tab. I'm going to hop over to the limited equity housing co-op tab. Let me get to the top. So this tab, a few differences. You'll notice that the key has orange text now, and the orange text are aspects of the model that are unique to limited equity co-ops versus the multifamily rental model. This only pops up a couple times. You'll see that we have, let me zoom in here. You'll see that we have a New permanent source that is limited equity co-op member shares. And you can read more about this and how this works in the glossary section. But this is a funding source for limited equity housing co-ops. You'll see that in the acquisition and rehab costs, we have co-op conversion legal fees, right? In addition to what would be your typical legal fees. When we go over here to the 15-year operating pro forma and the operating assumptions, we included a row for limited equity housing co-op consultant fees. This is important because managing a limited equity cooperative takes a lot of energy and knowledge and expertise. Sometimes that will come from the co-op members, the residents who are on the board, but not all the time. And we've really found it helpful to include consider payment for a consultant that can keep the ball moving, keep the ball rolling. Okay. The final difference in this tab is that unlike the multifamily rental, I'm going to zoom out just for a quick second. We're going to go down below the operating pro forma, below the running loan balances, and there's this table, member carrying charge affordability calculator. Now this table exists because limited equity housing co-op members don't pay rent. They pay a monthly carrying charge. This carrying charge is paid to manage building expenses. They pay it as part of their membership of the co-op. And this carrying charge, it's typically not based on the regional rental limits. It's typically based on the members' annual annual median income, much like homeownership affordability is calculated. So as you can see in this example, let me zoom in one more time. We are calculating what this member has available for its monthly housing costs. So basically what would be available for rent based on a 30% front end ratio, right? 30% of their income. Um, and this rent is being, and this monthly carrying charge is what is used to calculate, I'm going over to the unit mix, is what is used to calculate what the gross income will be for this property per month. So that is the difference here. And another note, let me go back down to this table. Another note on share loans. So share loans for limited equity co-op members, these are carefully calculated. This model won't tell you the size of the share loan that your members can service. A different model is needed for that. This model really only tells you one thing, and it's whether your members could even afford a share loan after they've covered their monthly carrying charge. I'll say this model looks a little, this number looks a bit out of whack because we still haven't balanced. Let me go over here. We still haven't balanced the sources and uses, but if we did, this number would fall more in line with what was realistic for this member to pay for the operating expenses and debt service, and whether or not they qualified for a share loan. So those are the major differences in this model, in this sheet. Now I'm going to go over to the multifamily and single family shared equity homeownership. These two tabs are the same. The only difference is single family. Let me go to the single family. You'll only have one unit. Only put in one unit for the single family. The multifamily, right, we're back to 12 units. Unfortunately, the costs don't carry over between projects, so you will have to put them in again or just copy paste. But it also gives you the flexibility to put different costs in each scenario. So the difference between the shared equity homeownership pro formas and the rental pro forma exists in what I mentioned, the perm phase, or in this case, the disposition phase. And instead of an operating pro forma, we have the initial sales price. So this tells you based on the family's median income, which remember we put into the income limits tab, what they have available for housing costs, and the maximum loan amount they can afford. So this essentially with down payment assistance, right? You're filling in these blue squares here. With down payment assistance available to that tenant, it tells you what the initial affordable sales price is. Now, this is the maximum affordable sales price, and there's often a difference between what the maximum sales price is in the market and what realistically folks seeking your type of home ownership will want to pay. Oftentimes, this affordable sales price is higher than what's actually realistic to ask for in the market. So just remember that. Um, and yeah, as I mentioned, you'll fill these in here. It'll spit this out. And this translates over to going all the way to the left, home sales, right? So this will be your repayment source for the acquisition, rehab, senior loans, any subordinate debt. Below this initial sales price table to the right are resale price projections. Now, this is the sweet spot of shared equity formulas. The beautiful thing about shared equity is that it remains affordable in perpetuity. And the way it remains affordable in perpetuity is that you would do a really good job at calculating the initial affordable price and using an informed resale formula to set the price thereafter. So this assumes that we're using a fixed rate formula. There are a couple different types of resale formulas as the note says, but we're making some assumptions that, in this market, or we've decided, apologies, that our resale price increases 2% per year. And that the AMI of the homeowner in this market is increasing 3% per year. So based on these assumptions, we can see the max resale price each year, what this home will be sold for, and what the future, the AMI of future homeowners will be at the sales price. And you always want to make sure that it's either at or below what the initial affordability was. This should also say the equity returned, and I'll make sure that's fixed before we share the model with y'all. Um, Now that we've walked through all of the different Proforma types, we're going to look at our portfolio as a whole. This occurs on the Fund Summary tab. The Fund Summary tab allows us now, based on what we've just input in each project Proforma sheet, it allows us to build out a portfolio of homes. We're going to say in our portfolio, we want to fund 4 multifamily rental projects of the type that we just modeled out, 2 limited equity co-ops, 4 multifamily shared equity homeownership projects, and 1 single family. Maybe we'll say 5. Let's throw in 5. As you can see, I'm able to change these. And as I change these, I don't know if you saw that, but pay attention to this number here, right? Initially I had 121 units. And when I change it to 5, it changes to 125 units. So this is adding up all of our units across all projects. And down here below, it's giving us some averages per unit per the type of project and across all projects. And it's also summing, right, total development costs across each project type and across all projects. And what might be relevant to us is the subsidy per unit per project type and the subsidy portfolio wide. Or maybe we're more interested in the debt at the rehab stage or the perm debt. So this allows us to get a sense, right? And maybe our program has a subsidy budget. So it'll tell us how over the subsidy budget we are. Right? These are all fake numbers, no reason for alarm. You're going to put in what is relevant to you and your program and your region, and it'll come out with some numbers that you have something to work with. So that's a summary of how this model works. If you all have any questions, please don't please don't hesitate to reach out. We hope this is helpful for you, and have fun with it. Thank you.